Hello everyone, today we talk about the United States and Western Europe in the Reconstruction era, roughly 1945-1955. This is the first video, if I'm not wrong, in absolute terms of our new manualistic history of, in fact, modern and contemporary world, without limits, really. We talked about this for a long time, namely never having addressed these centuries, the last half millennium of our history, but from a essentially military standpoint. That's how it began on Schwerpunkt. We began essentially with a medieval history manual, just for sort of paving the way to some sort of more constructed research military content to graft on. Then we immediately started telling it with ancient and also modern warfare. Remember, some of you naturally, like from the Anglosphere, persuaded to call everything modern up to this day. Like my scanning is more continental, and it has to do essentially with the modern age as 1492 to essentially 1789, and everything from then on up to this point in time is contemporary history. So technically also Napoleon is contemporary history, right? I've always used this terminology. I know that sometimes it can generate some confusion. This is not quite the point. The point here being that finally we're talking about this eras also from a more comprehensive standpoint, not just the military dives that we started, especially in the last couple of years, to make, right? At history that went beyond the 17th, the 18th century. Something more constructed, right? For a long time stopped to the Napoleonic era, basically. However, we experimented, especially with, I would say, the 20th century. And what we have today is also fundamentally substantial and a good point to, in fact, start from for adding this kind of content. It's obvious that the topics discussed can at some point widen dramatically. I mean, the topics we're going to cover today are immense. They all deserve sort of many videos on their own, each one, the several that we're going to touch upon. So this is obviously an introduction in any case, and just to fill the gaps and also to see how the audience reacts, because I don't know how, this is the first time I make this type of content. I have no idea whether it's going to be watched more or less. This topic, for example, just per title, is probably interesting. For perceived or expected political drama or whatever, it's not going to be that. Obviously, we're talking about more contemporary issues, and so everything becomes immediately more political, but it's also just a matter of properly covering history, and we'll do this in a very comprehensive, compact way. In fact, this series will probably be even more random than we think under the profile of topics disparity, in a way, because there is really a lot into it. It's not merely a simply linear history treated all in the same way. There's going to be a lot of thematic stuff, movie reviews, all kind of things that you can imagine building on some history of literature and more that can help understand better the present as well as the past. Now, the years following World War II presented distinct challenges for the United States and the nations of Western Europe as they navigated a transition from wartime conditions to peacetime realities. This judgment is not to say that the rest of the world was having fun. Actually, was in deep blip, to say the least. And in the West, we're actually doing better than anybody else by far. And even after the war, in many ways. Of course, if you look at particular conditions in Germany, etc., I would say, okay, well, these countries had been steamrolled, and so they weren't doing better in the moment than other countries out there. But in general, as we will see now, the preconditions for rebuilding and the actual pace of reconstruction were utterly insane, right? That we speak of the economic miracle, as you know, of the probably the booming era. I should say we remember the boomers in a sense in their conceptual phase, so to say, because what in fact the West sprang out from it is something that is often misunderstood. Lots of people today look at the issues existing in the world and in these very countries and say, oh, well, it all started from World War II. Because basically we fought from the wrong side, or at least the system that, I can't speak for that because my ancestors fought from the other side specifically, but the, say, as a culture, as a civilization today, as deeply Western as we can be, they were wrong, right? And that's why you have immigrants today. And that's a very far-fetched conclusion because, up to, 30 or 50 years ago, definitely the West did not have even a hint, a trace of some of these issues. Indeed, there is, and this is as true as it gets, and as we will see now, also as far as McCarthyism, for example, a huge problem with communism and Marxism, not just obviously during the Cold War, but due to probably internal issues like domestic opponents, so to say, that were, as always, as there were Nazi fascists in the United States, in Britain, during World War II, etc., were sort of rowing backwards, right, compared to Western direction in favor of communism, and also for whichever reasons. Today we will not dive strongly into that, but it's also something that you have to understand more as a struggle. It's not like the West came out in a package, standardly, uniformly provided with the seeds for radical leftistic extremism. That's just a complete distortion of reality, even the current one, as a matter of fact. And as this channel, for example, really proves, because even though I always said to be sort of clamorously beyond far right wing in terms of sort of courageous conviction, I always was a right winger, like most people that from my generation sort of came to conservatism later. And those are the worst in many ways. But I don't need to take specifically radical positions on certain issues or certain historical interpretations just to, catch views or, try to look cool or sound cool, whatever. This is not really a matter of opinion. That there is a much more complex reality that if lesser people didn't have a third world schooling compared to what the first one that we had when even just 20 years ago, probably would be very easy to even just develop and understand on the road. But that's in fact the collapse of an entire globe, right? This is not just about the West. We as leaders obviously should be better, and while we still are, of course, we must understand that any weakness is only illusory, right? A weakness is the one of those who fear, who imagine to be weak, especially in this moment of history that is overwhelmingly and unspeakingly affluent by any standard, even barely conceivable, truly, just 30 years ago. We still have people who think that we're living in a psychodrama, that even when addressing, in fact, serious problems that are very real and very concrete, they're in fact not able to do anything, right? We all see at least that there is an enormous sense of opposition to certain political directions that the world takes. But aside from complaining, there doesn't seem to be much change. And a great part of the reason, I think, is also the fact that people do not, in fact, really know behind this mask of the political siding much in terms of what they're actually even supposed to believe, right? I don't think that even a person that was born 10 years after me in a specific part of the West, different from mine, that's not descending to the differences, is actually a Westerner like me, even if they are, fully, ethnic Europeans, because they completely are neurocognitively rewired in a way that is incredibly defective and I think incomplete in terms of the human standards that we had up to just, again, very short time prior. And so it's useless if this person decides to side from this side or this other. The problem is not much going in a direction. The point is collapse, right? The quality properly of human value utterly collapsing, and therefore sort of creating an empty building that can't sustain itself without a skeleton, in fact. And that's the greatest threat to civilization, I suppose, even to very specific sort of declarative, self-describing political orientations. Now, while the pressures of the emerging Cold War influenced developments on both sides of the Atlantic, and will surely, again, this is redundant on Schwerpunkt, but I must say it every time, we will make trillions of videos on every single letter, every single character just spelled, all right? But this is not a video. These specific situations varied significantly, right? So the differences within the West that make the West still so compact, it's not a paradox, but it's actually what we are. So the feminists would start a video like this by saying, I don't know, millions of women who had entered the workforce during the war, often in defense industries, or as iconic, quote-unquote, Rosie the Riveter figures, symbolizing the more than 6 million American women drawn into factories, specifically shipyards and offices, to replace the over 15 million men serving overseas, face this dismissal or strong social and employer pressure to return to domestic roles as millions of servicemen demobilized. And a non-feministic channel, like I've just made, could simply state the same, observing that that's exactly what things had to revert to, and most of these women were actually glad of. There's no doubt that, of course, things changed in times of war. There had been radical changes in the relation between the sexes during World War I, for example. World War II obviously added further on that. And there is no doubt, again, that there is a creeping secularization, modernization, and that World War II in particular being waged against overtly nationalistic, racialistic regimes that properly spotted in the restoration also of a corrupted society by the left. The only purpose the only goal, right, of themselves would create this backlash against the seriousness of some of those stakes in general culture. Telling the truth, as we were saying before, the 1940s, 1950s, even a substantial part of the 1960s were at large sort of in line with straightforward kind of conservative. Traditional is a bit too difficult at this point in history, really, to even use as a term. Direction, however, and we have this interesting figure, after all, in social history. Between 1945 and 1947, female employment in the United States fell by about 3.25 million overall, with many married so-called roses, again, among those pushed out despite surveys showing most wanted to continue working. And this not, as we were saying before, we would say, but this is contrasting what you said before, because they had sort of a necessarily less sort of some liberal beliefs developed through that experience, but because actually the general picture was not so positive socioeconomically, and these jobs naturally had helped these women while the men were at war. And so obviously, by some degree, they wanted to continue that. Many women worked at the time in general, even aside from the war. And so the point here being there's something, even after the victory, that has come actually at a substantial cost. And this is what we're looking at today. The West has to rewire in order to come back into those traditional family structures that, in fact, were still praised at this point. There was a cultural emphasis on them, and you can't even say that the shift of these women coming back home, still working, obviously contributing to the households they had done also prior, would largely back it in a way. It was a way to realize that the change had been temporary if things were to go back like as before. This in parallel and obviously caused the baby boom, because of course, like in any case, there was more stability. Now that after the war, women worked less, men came back home, And so you have this birth, and even just a sort of overall enthusiasm, the birth rates surging dramatically between 1945 and the mid-1950s, right? That's when my parents were born, for example, with the total fertility rate rising from about 2.3 in 1940 to a peak near 3.8 by 1957, partly because older women, by the way, who had gained wartime experience, stayed in the labor force and crowded out younger women, pushing many of the latter toward earlier marriage and motherhood as well. So again, this channel is not particularly into these things to begin with, but there are interesting dynamics to observe. You can also get a bit more philosophical in a traditional sense. Imagine, again, being a man at war and realizing what truly matters in a higher sense, right? This would be the unavoidable outcome of the, not just the end of the war, but of victory. This does not obviously diminish the baby booming that occurs also in the defeated nations, interestingly enough. And we should point out that, of course, Germany, Italy, Japan would go on to be some of the richest and longest living countries in the world, whereas the Eastern Bloc in Europe sort of remained deep into its own blip, right? So that's something you want to appreciate in many ways. Now, in the United States, the abrupt end of Lend-Lease aid from Britain and other allies in 1945 compounded reconversion pressures as factories faced sudden order cancellations and the economy risked sliding back into pre-war stagnation without new demand drivers. In the United States, demobilization released millions of veterans into the civilian workforce, prompting initial fears of renewed mass unemployment, similar to the 1930s after the 1929 crisis. Yet the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, commonly known as the GI Bill, signed in 1944, eased this shift by offering tuition assistance for higher education, low-interest home loans, and business startup support, ultimately fueling suburban growth and a consumer spending surge. By 1947, consider that this costs a lot. 1944 is the same year of Bretton Woods and so on. So you want to appreciate in general the how also for the negatives, the fact that the Cold War began. You can't even specifically pinpoint a moment in time, but still well within World War II. By 1947, veterans made up essentially half of college enrollments, and over 7.8 million used the benefits for education or training by 1956. We're talking United States, obviously, here first, while VA-backed home loans helped veterans purchase about 1/5 of all new homes built in the early post-war years. Veterans' benefits also included unemployment compensation for up to a year, which helped smooth the labor market transition, while millions enrolled in colleges, dramatically expanding access to higher education and contributing to a skilled workforce boom in the 1950s, right? When, in fact, unsurprisingly, American stuff in general rocked hard, both in quantity and quality. And as we'll see now, this is all in parallel also with the Marshall Plan and with the sort of Americanization of the West at many levels. When you look at minorities at this point, like what was the idea at the time? Naturally, there was a staunch imagination. There were barriers. Here we're talking about, just making from an ethnic point of view, African or Mexican Americans. At this point, there were all kind of discriminations. At this point, I don't know, gay people were very much ousted of society. So this was part of the world of the time. It was understood to be fully moral at large. At least there were already, again, ideologies that were going to erode this idea. But they encountered limits in accessing the aforementioned benefits due, for example, to local administration practice. that could be discriminatory. We know, for example, black veterans often receiving substantially lower real cash equivalents for education and housing support compared to white counterparts. In some southern states, only a tiny fraction of VA home loans went to non-white veterans. And Japanese Americans returning from internment camps or military service struggled with property losses and social reintegration. That's yet another very interesting aspect of the story, what had happened in the United States. Eugenics was very much out there, not just in the United States. It had been the case in, the neutral Sweden during World War II. In strictly conceptual terms, we're not very distant from what the same, so many racial legislations had been issued, even in Nazi Germany, for example. And this is, again, I don't make this point to specifically claim, I don't know, so the Americans were hypocrites. It's just so understanding how literally normal certain aspects of these really were in the society and culture of the time, and how distant we are, right? Not commenting for better or for worse, depending on what we're talking about specifically, but how real, from a historical point of view, this was. And how different, for example, even way before that, things really were. For those, this is very important to me because when you look especially at history of religions, there is always this point that certain liberal-leaning critics tend to do. Like, that is, first of all, how do we know what they actually believed, say, 200, 300 years ago? But secondly, how intensely did they believe that? Did they believe that more or less, right? What was society and culture all about? Right. So I'm not going to digress on this now, but it's incredibly important to affirm. Now, unlike the other belligerent countries whose territories had suffered extensive wartime destruction, the main issue for the United States was not physical reconstruction, but economic reconversion. The American economic system had been almost entirely oriented towards military production. In the final years of the war in particular, had been extraordinarily stimulated by it. By 1945, compared with 1939, industrial output had doubled, unemployment had disappeared completely, and national income had increased by 3/4. This powerful wartime machine now had to be redirected towards civilian purposes, all while the country assumed new and expanded global responsibilities, took on new challenges, had to respond to new threats. Factories that had churned out tanks and aircraft pivoted rapidly to automobiles simply because the attrition rate that existed during the war was no more and made it completely useless to produce new ones at that speed, at least. Household appliances and new homes with pent-up consumer demand bolstered by high wartime saving rates driving a boom that saw new car sales quadruple between 1945 and 1955. And this is very much, again, you even know from movies, from general cultural references, how that 1950s United States apparent dream, because people lived, especially in material terms, much worse than today. They had to work much more and so on, but still, like as a picture, as an image, you know where it comes from. The Housing Act of 1949, part of the limited Fair Deal successes under President Truman, authorized slum clearance and the construction of over 800,000 units of low-income public housing, while also expanding federal support for urban redevelopment, addressing urban overcrowding exacerbated by wartime migration to defense plans. Meanwhile, private suburban developments like Levittown on Long Island, built by William Levitt and Sons starting in 1947, with mass production techniques that allowed homes to be completed in as little as 1 day per unit, exemplified this shift by offering standardized, affordable, tract homes with modern amenities that accelerated white middle-class flight from cities and reshaped American living patterns through FHA and VA mortgage guarantees enabling low down payment purchases. Leading the nation through this delicate transition was the aforementioned president, Harry Truman. As already noted, Truman possessed strong practical judgment and decision-making abilities. He was a down-to-earth leader who proudly identified as an ordinary, everyday American. However, he lacked both the broad vision and the personal charisma of his predecessor. On the domestic scene, Truman sought to extend the reformist legacy of the Roosevelt years through his Fair Deal program, literally meaning the just deal. Now, every comment or judgment here is not to be understood as, qualitative or right in a political sense. If I say that Roosevelt had constituted sort of a greater figure in American history, that's kind of obvious in many ways, regardless, again, of specific beliefs. In any case, this initiative of Truman's achieved only partial success, largely because of resistance from a Republican-controlled Congress after the 1946 midterm elections and from Southern Democrats who opposed any steps toward racial integration. Interestingly enough, among the Fair Deal's proposals were expansions of public housing, federal aid for education, and national health insurance, though Congress approved only limited measures such as raising minimum wage to 75 cents per hour in 1949 and broadening Social Security coverage to include about 10 million more workers while blocking most civil rights elements, despite Truman's 1948 executive order desegregating the armed forces, at least. The American Medical Association mounted a vigorous and costly campaign against proposed national health insurance, framing it as quote-unquote socialized medicine, to exploit Cold War fears of communism and helping derail that element of the agenda. Compounding these political difficulties were serious economic pressures. Following the end of the war, the lifting of government controls over industry, together with a large federal budget deficit burdened by continued military expenditures and overseas aid programs, triggered a significant rise in the cost of living as well. Workers responded with a wave of demands for higher wages and widespread labor unrest. Major strikes erupted in 1945-46 across key sectors including automobiles, steel, coal mining, railroads, and electrical manufacturing, involving over 5 million workers at their peak as unions sought to offset inflation and regain bargaining power lost during wartime wage freezes. This, you understand the implications, obviously, that it had been a sort of propped up system that now sort of the United States was trying to move away from, and there was great recalcitrance from unions that said, no, we want to be kept being paid more than we actually get. And this unprecedented strike wave prompted Congress in 1947, against the president's wishes and over his veto, to pass the Taft-Hartley Act, a conservative anti-labor law that restricted the right to strike in industries deemed vital to national interests, banned closed shops, and allowed states to enact right-to-work laws. This is also very important because the system, in any case, was to go on, yet also these categories were evidently provided with some important leverage for the American industry. Nevertheless, the core achievements of the New Deal were safeguarded at the same time. Indeed, after Truman's re-election in 1948, there was even some expansion of social welfare programs. Still, consider here we haven't looked what had happened from a financial point of view, the gold reserves, but you know that the Americans controlled de facto 2/3 of global gold reserves. So it's a completely unique time in history in the world, right, in general, but specifically for sort of evaluating these American policies in ways that, in fact, have barely nothing to do with what we're looking at today and in other times in history. There are parallelisms as well, but everything must always be very much contextualized. in fact, still here, the ideological momentum of the Roosevelt era appeared to be exhausted at the same time. This decline resulted both from the disappearance of the particular economic and social conditions, in fact, that had given rise to it, so the Great Depression, and from the new climate of mobilization and ideological confrontation brought about by the Cold War at the same time. So not just the Second World War had brought about this great sort of momentum, industrially wise, but there was now a global, a renewed global threat, right? One that was in strictly sort of global spread, even in fact more threatening than what the Axis had been, that after all had, yes, threatened from Europe to achieve unprecedented power and so on. Here at this point, the Soviets still don't have the bomb, but in general, things are moving toward that direction. So it's a completely different scenario. And this metus hostilis, as we've seen in as many other times of history, requires this level of political cohesion, of social conservatism, of cultural strength, right? And this is reflected in U.S. History at this point. Now, you have the Employment Act of 1946, formalizing federal responsibility for promoting full employment and stable prices, reflecting a cautious commitment to still essentially Keynesian-style management amid reconversion uncertainties, right? Let's keep propping things up as long as we have the resources available in the moment, so not to destabilize things with too much of a gamble. This act established the Council of Economic Advisors to provide the president with ongoing analysis, marking a shift toward more systematic federal economic oversight without full-scale planning. The intensifying Cold War atmosphere contributed directly to one of the most controversial episodes of the period, or at least one that would become controversial. Here we start from the general, then we tend to make some criticism. And this is actually a very important topic, especially from 1949 onward, coinciding with the Soviet Union's now first atomic bomb test. An intense anti-communist campaign swept the United States. It took the form of a genuine witch hunt by some degree, but again, without context, it would be very easy to simply dismiss or to even pretend that it was a negative thing, as most people in general are told, right, in today's schools. Now, the central figure in this movement was Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy, from whom the term McCarthyism derived. McCarthy chaired a congressional committee established to suppress so-called un-American activities, and in 1950, Congress passed the Internal Security Act, which provided the main legal instrument for purging or marginalizing individuals in public administration, culture, or entertainment who were suspected of pro-communist sympathies or left-wing leanings. This seems obvious that there is so much at stake, not just global, but also in a moral sense. The United States are the indisputed moral winners of World War II, right? Regardless of the debate you can make regarding material resources, whatever, would the Soviet Union win without the Lend-Lease at Somalia? There's no doubt that in a strictly sort of objectively morally superior sense, the Americans have the upper hand. All right, they are the ones who are literally, as we will see now, also be reconstructing the free world and protecting it from the barbarism of communism. And not just there is a great pride in what has been accomplished during World War II, but in this sense, a renewed confidence in American power and its wielding. If domestically you have a front, as it did actually exist, is fundamentally trying to oppose this kind of views because of different reasons, but indeed also a great deal of communist or foreign influence, and some general self-sabotaging reason of the same mold, well, from the side of saying U.S. citizens engaging in this, it is really difficult, given the sort of also general social cultural conditions we're looking at this point, the political and moral one as well, the strategic, the economic, like to presume that communism had to be tolerated and that certain phenomena in the public sphere especially were to be tolerated. The House Un-American Activities Committee had already targeted the Hollywood film industry, for example, in 1947, leading to the citation of the Hollywood 10 for contempt of Congress and the issuance of the Waldorf Statement by studio executives, which effectively created a blacklist barring hundreds of suspected leftists from employment in entertainment. And many of them were literally faking it, like were hiding their actual beliefs, but there was a radical reason to suspect. And again, today we're not going to look at that in detail, as many of them were also Soviet spies for sure, and even one is too much indeed. Now, the most extreme phase of McCarthyism lasted until 1955, when the senators' indiscriminate accusations, including the serious error of attacking the US military, ultimately backfired. This, again, we'll see in much greater depth in general, but the whole temper here is not, especially in these years, to be simply dismissed, because there isn't just the United States, by the way, as the Soviets are mainly threatening, at least by strategic ambition, the European continent as a whole. And what happens in different European countries, in fact, not much different from what was happening in the United States from a political standpoint. All right, there are strong communist parties that have also in free Europe joined the constitutional arc of Western democracy, and under the threat of communism, that at some point in conditions here of that were yet to fully recover from the abyss of the war, were indeed very threatening and required very strong control. We'll see how also properly intelligence means regarding, for example, Soviet advancement or lack of, for that matter, were at this point posing great problems also in the military, strategically, also in the same industry and technological research, etc. So it's not an easy moment, right? Nobody has ever come out of something like World War II. Still, here we're talking the boom because the boom begins somehow in the United States early, right? In Europe, it sort of arrives, it's shifted in time. It's most like the end of the 1950s, the beginning of the 1960s. There are very specific moments, right, that manage probably to take up once again many European nations, right, in a very meaningful way, both politically, strategically, etc. But this is not some strange discrimination for no reason because of paranoia or because of evil or some fascistic drifting or whatever. This is a real, especially from an American perspective, definitely was not, for example, looking at neo-fascist movements in Europe that would have fought alongside them had the communists invaded, for that matter. We're doing this to preserve properly for the time standards, at least traditional way of life that was undoubtedly threatened and in any case offended by Marxism and all its ramifications. And this, I'll tell you, as a historian, is still very relevant in the sense that one has to also wonder why so many intellectuals became Marxist at a point. This is evidently not connected with any particular scientificity. This is not connected with standards of absolute knowledge or actual truth. This is a specific product of history. Certain swings happen constantly in many circumstances. You can immediately understand how or why. What is the general feeling? Why certain figures would lean towards certain directions, what would push them, etc. So you have always to understand the causes of it. which is not simply condemning. Still, that's something that you should do when obviously this is immoral and unscientific, which is actually the same thing if you really think about it. But also understanding in this sense how the mistake is the measure of defeatability, right? And why, in any case, things, this cultural Marxism, especially in the second half of the 20th century, was unfortunately injected in our world. We're still paying for it, handling, reduction, disposal. But in this sense, it's the product of a specific generation, of a specific moment in history. And you can't understand it, and especially also in a broader arc, also through this segment, because it's not a cultural Marxist of the 1970s, but one of the 1950s or the 1990s for that matter, right? So that's something we'll come back on in other videos. Now, after receiving a formal censure from the Senate in December 1954, McCarthy was forced to withdraw, because this had backfired essentially, from the public stage. Televised Army McCarthy hearings in 1954 broadcast live to millions and featuring dramatic exchanges such as Army Counsel Joseph Welch's rebuke. Quote, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" at long last exposed his aggressive tactics to a national audience, accelerating the decline in his public support and contributing to his eventual political isolation. But this does not mean that it was fundamentally a positive thing to have happened to begin with, nor that McCarthy's positions were fundamentally unfounded, or regardless of the character, there was no such a thing like a real threat, nor that these ideas wouldn't have, in fact, a continued life in American politics, and also to severe undermine many aspects of the same, both at home and abroad. Now, loyalty review programs initiated under Truman in 1947 screened federal employees, resulting in thousands of dismissals or resignations over alleged subversive ties, further intensifying the atmosphere of suspicion across government agencies and private sectors. Investigations extended into academia, labor unions, and even the State Department, where alleged security risks were scrutinized amid broader fears amplified by events like the fall of China to communism in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, against also the same Chinese, practically. In Western Europe, the Cold War likewise exerted a restraining influence, to say the least. There it served to block or at least limit the reformist momentum that had emerged in the final stages of the Second World War, a momentum encouraged by the participation of leftist parties in wartime and immediate post-war government coalitions. Right, and this happened from kind of all sides at the end of the day. And it's sort of very disturbing, as we'll see now, for example, in the case of Britain, how this emerged actually from the humus that sort of removed the winners themselves. It had very different ideas on the world that perhaps should have been considered in many ways. And we all know in that case actually how detrimental, especially in British history, that change really was. But you have from the other side, and not less threateningly, if you look at France, at Italy, etc., some very specific and big communist forces that had been for a while still in arms, by the way, among the winners and successfully entering local politics. Much like the situation after World War I, this reformist drive was rooted in a widespread popular expectation of major social and institutional transformations. People viewed these changes both as compensation for the immense sufferings endured during the war and as a chance for a profound moral renewal that might eliminate the root causes of future wars. I will not digress on World War I and for example, the Bolshevik ideologies within it, the Marxistic opportunism, even in supporting their own same countries in certain cases, so turn it to a national but not nationalistic feeling that always overlapped even to some degree, right? We've seen it also with the SA for that matter, in Weimar Republic, Germany. Of the socialist movements, the mutinies, how this would have been written later by, again, the idea of the backstabbing and everything. We've seen this in the case of the German army in World War One, etc. In World War II, this takes on. So first of all, World War One had definitely seen a mass society going at war, right? A society that was essentially now largely literate, that had already gained some specific civic rights and so on. So there was a level of mass and populistic sentiment, whereby if you have fought, you also are owed more liberty. And if this does not happen, you'll actually still keep the gun ready. And so this is something that in many countries did happen. Not in the most sort of stabilized, civilized, and especially one of the winners, but still, right, in many other circumstances. World War II was now different, because from one side, as we already anticipated, the fact that this had been a victory over Nazi fascism brought the right and so the traditionally conservative establishment, even when we're talking of the left, so if we're talking about the years prior, especially World War One, so they were still very, for today's standards, conservative, culturally conservative parties in many ways. After World War II, again, the spread of Marxism was unhinged. Right, we know that essentially also the spread of this ideology in education, etc., was properly decided at a table. Right, part of the institutions would follow Christianity and other communism, etc. So this was the result of a political compromise, where entire constitutions, for example, were rewritten at the table between, say, Catholics and communists. Right, so giving birth to modern countries. Just contemporary countries to rewire their condition. At the same time, you have a pretty strong sense, not just a pretty strong sense that, of course, the Soviets, the Warsaw Pact are pretty threatening by themselves. But, and this is also somehow underrated, and some would say controversial, but say on Schwerpunkt we wouldn't call it like that just per se, a lot of actual Nazi fascists that have fundamentally remained there, had survived the war, and were tactically siding with the, at this point, Western democracies, for obvious reasons, because in any case, the Western democracies were much closer to civilization and the same idea that the Nazi fascists had of it than communism, in any case. As we were saying before, the Americans were also pretty distrustful, right? There were paramilitary organizations were established all across the West. There were also former fascists that would have manned the thing, were entrusted with, at least were not entrusted because of the Americans, of specific control of weapons, ammo, depots, properly to unearth in case of communist invasion. This is actually one of the single most beautiful and interesting chapters, in my opinion, in the history of the 20th century, especially, again, in the immediate World War II aftermath, say, but continuing for a couple of decades. And as long, in any case, as the Cold War went on. And as such, also a paradox, namely the fact that regardless of what we commonly think, Nazi fascism didn't actually die out there. Like throughout the 1950s, I think that you can say most Germans, but something equivalent by scale, still believed, after all, that Hitler was not even that bad guy, and that after all, maybe the bad guys had won the war. And here, I'm not talking obviously just about the the realization of what happened in East Germany, of what the socialists, quote unquote, were not properly communists, were up to and doing in practice. We're talking probably the civilized world. We're talking West Germany. We're talking even some, again, what will turn now again into, had already been, telling the truth, the boundaries between Germany are not so random, right? In the split, by the way, between the West and East allies, the most advanced parts of Europe, the richest, the most productive. Now, it's, especially as European, it's complicated, as you understand, to talk about this stuff, because it's probably Americans would make better content about the American part, but it's interesting for me to see how this also happened in my family back in generations. Now, across the region, so we're talking Western Europe in general, wartime destruction obviously had left millions homeless, infrastructure in ruins, and agricultural and industrial output far below pre-war levels, with food shortages and fuel crises exacerbating social tensions in the harsh winters of 1946-1947. These were dangerous times, all right, because the communists, those that had participated in resistance, had still weapons somewhere, right? And there were even some specific outbreaks of Soviet revolution, right? This happened in different Western countries. The severe 1947 winter, with record low temperatures and coal shortages, paralyzed transport and industry across much of the continent, heightening political instability and, again, boosting especially communist appeal in several countries until American aid began to flow. Right? Today we don't talk about what the possibilities for Europe were still open at this point, some dreadful ones. Obviously, the United States made the right thing, but it's not like, as we were saying before, that they had deeply ingrained within their own culture the obviousness of this choice, all right? And today, if you look at the right wing, it's all, people think that history is all about the familiarity with the same race, right? We all know what even pretty white people like the Irish, the Germans, the Poles were thought of and treated like in the United States, all right, at some point in history. And still, during World War I and World War II, of course, like the idea, like, are these people even white? There was a time, of course, in which the Germans were considered white. The Irish weren't kind of considered, I'd say, in the probably most pure English, and in that sense of English derivation, American sense of ethnic identity. The Poles, etc. That's not a thing. People at this time in history, as they had always done, hated each other on a political basis, largely, in times like these, in which there was a pretty sort of, at least historically, understood sense of national identity. Admittedly, for the United States, it was different, and so the country developed in ways that are naturally very different from Europe. But regardless also of the racialistic theories, there already at the time spotted like a certain continuity in ethnogenetic familiarity across Europe based on phenotype, is the radical competition between peoples, countries, that actually matters, right? To many Americans, those Germans or those Italians had to be wiped the hell out. And of course, there were lots of German and Italian Americans. That is also part of the reason why, especially in the case of the Italian Americans, it wasn't such a thing like a Nuremberg trial in Italy, for example, or not even in Japan, but at this point, obviously for reasons that allude from race specifically, or from, in this sense, ethnic groups and so on. That's for saying that the world is complicated, and also geopolitics does not exist, obviously enough. But consider this even from an American standpoint. I mean, during World War II, not even between Americans and British, they actually liked each other very much, right? So we have this idea of a sort of good, positive, linear understanding of the hundreds of thousands of Allies came to die for us, and that we would have been allegedly all happy, especially after the war in any case. But that's not actually how things work to begin with, right? And even less like things like it's the Jewish bankers that made the world, that kind of stuff. Like, things are big, complicated, bloody as hell, and really painful, right? And incredibly destructive. And this is why also we should be eternally grateful for what happened after all, not just because things go much worse than this, but because what we have right now is evidently something that preserved some great parts of the good elements, right? If those had not happened today, we would be complaining much more in spite of all what is happening right now, in part due to the same outcome of World War II. You can argue, not in the sense that, again, we are necessarily thinking that the Nazi fascists would have done anything better, but in the sense that, again, you may never know how anything can go. And so history is not for the simple-minded in general, all right? Now, as I was saying before, the most striking and painful illustration of this reformist impulse occurred in Britain, right? In the general election of July 1945, Winston Churchill was unexpectedly, as notoriously defeated and replaced by a Labour government headed by Clement Attlee. The new administration moved swiftly to nationalize the Bank of England, the electricity and coal industries. This is big, right? Consider that some of say fascist Italy had nationalized a lot of stuff, all right? It was the second most nationalized country after World War II. So for telling you how much of a socialistic bias is present in absolute terms, even within the fascist world and the liberal democracies, from all kind of possible directions. So why it's never obvious how a system would go. The iron and the steel sector, right? Here we're talking about the British Empire, all right? We're talking about the Royal Navy, even though, again, things had evidently gone downhill at this point. The Americans had taken over. In general, right? It appears like it's as an incredibly undermining and disproportionate choice. The same transport system was nationalized. Hell, the new administration introduced a minimum wage and established the National Health Service in 1948, which ensured completely free medical care for everyone at the point of use by nationalizing hospitals under Health Minister Aneurin Bevan, while facing initial resistance from doctors concerned about professional autonomy as well. So it's not like there hasn't to be a balance, right? Every country on earth has some social welfare. It's not an option. There isn't like the thing like in Europe we are socialists because, we have more health care, and so in practice we are less conservative than you in the United States. It doesn't work like that, all right? It's just a part of how the system goes. In any case, the government in Britain also implemented more progressive taxation and significantly expanded the social security network. Collectively, these policies laid the foundations of the, in fact, properly called welfare state, an ambitious system designed to support citizens, quote, from the cradle to the grave. Additional nationalizations encompass gas, civil aviation, and road haulage, while the National Insurance Act of 1946 consolidated benefits for sickness, unemployment, maternity, and pensions. The 1944 Education Act further aimed to broaden access to schooling, and these British reforms drew partly from the social democratic measures implemented, by the way, in Sweden during the 1930s, while also showing the clear influence of Roosevelt's New Deal, with many key ideas originally set out in the famous 1942 Beveridge Report prepared by liberal economist William Beveridge that identified 5, quote, giant evils, including want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, and proposed comprehensive social insurance to slay them. The same 1930s Sweden that, again, had eugenetic legislation for that matter, just like in the United States. So things can be really different, and it's naturally naive to presume, and unfortunately this is also the bottom line of this, that want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness simply fall by providing welfare state. The matter naturally is a bit more complicated. It's not like the British didn't think about this while we're doing it, but in general, we saw where this would lead mentally, socially, culturally in the following generations. In fact, its strict application in a Britain that was economically exhausted by the war effort demanded considerable sacrifices still from the population. Right? This is an aspect that is often under appreciated both after World War I and World War II, that indeed even the winners had great difficulties in coming out of the sort of swampy ground that they had remained into for a long time. It's not the video this one to talk about how critical the situation for the British was internationally, historically. For several years, people had to endure continued wartime-style restrictions, including high taxation and the rationing of basic consumer goods. A severe balance of payments crisis in 1947, combined with a harsh fuel shortage that winter, has enforced further austerity measures and delayed the lifting of controls, while sterling convertibility attempts in 1947 quickly collapsed. These hardships contributed to the Conservatives' return to power in 1951. The pendulum always swings. Bread rationing, unprecedented even during the war in Britain, was introduced in 1946 amid global food shortages, and clothing and petrol remained tightly controlled, contributing to public fatigue despite overall improvements in working-class living standards compared to the 1930s. So everything came at a cost, indeed. It's so incomplete, obviously, to just browse like this, like the situation. But we have to cover, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, also different other aspects here. In fact, similar but distinct developments unfolded in France, right? That had an incredibly important role, not just as a symbol of European sort of injustice suffered by its people and of resistance, even though French resistance was not so active and actually relevant as other resistances, for example, the Italian one. But there was a narrative here that had to bring France to the table of winners. I made a video about Charles de Gaulle, in general, explaining why that was a necessity in many ways. France also, so obviously cities like Strasbourg, symbolically enough, had been reconquered by free French forces. Or at that point, actually, France had already been with its own government abroad, but reinstated rule from its country itself. So obviously it feels sometimes like France, it's not like it didn't morally deserve to have the place, but obviously to have been mostly put there for a facade reason, because after all, and this is the point here that makes it all worth it, because indeed both world wars had been largely triggered by the Franco-German enmity, conflictuality, competition, right? And at this point in history, you have the necessity not just of reviving a Western democratic world, but obviously for it to be as strong, as capable of stemming, like creating a first line of defense in the world against the communistic predations in the East. And historically, Germany had played such an important role. We risked that Poland had saved Europe on the Vistula when the Red Army would have, after World War I, essentially spread across the entirety of Europe because Germany was destroyed. Even the Western winners were exhausted, etc. During World War II, naturally, Germany was the one who tried to take out, also unavoidably, also necessarily, with French and Italian industry, the Soviet Union, and almost succeeded, by the way. At this point in history, the problem is that the German potential had been not just largely annihilated by the war, but the country was split between the West and the communists, right? So France had a crucial role. That here we're not going to look at it in a broader international strategic sense. The French also did much to hamper a full integration of European forces into a proper army in 1953. The European Community of Defense was essentially aborted by the French veto. There are very interesting things that are happening here that we'll talk in the video about NATO. Thus, unavoidably, with Italy destroyed as well as an Axis power, and one that had seen not much widespread destruction early in the war, but after it had pulled out of it with the Allies from one side and the Nazis from the other, Nazi-fascists from the other, France was historically the only country in continental Europe provided with the tendential potential, so to say, and capacity of an hegemonic power, one that could at least prevent probably an hegemonic spread of a communist force from the East. As we all know, obviously, continental forces alone could have not stopped the Warsaw Pact, but obviously you had the Americans, you have NATO established exactly for this. It was mostly a matter of buying time until the Americans could arrive. So we're not going to look at this in particular, but France was crucial for the refoundation of Europe in so many ways. Today we talk mostly about its internal politics and trying to report it to this picture. In France, nationalization programs and expanded social security measures were introduced first by the provisional government led by the same Charles de Gaulle, that naturally represented a conservative force in general between 1944 and 1945, and subsequently by coalition cabinets based on cooperation among three major mass parties. The communist one, the SFIO, and the Popular Republican movement of Christian democratic inspiration, right? So the SFIO were the socialists, right? So this trio is somehow very similar to what happens in other Western democracies. And actually, it's disturbing enough to see how strong the communists and the socialists were. Now, all three parties had emerged significantly strengthened from the first post-war elections in October 1945, gaining ground at the expense of the Radical Party and older moderate groups. In 1946, the authorities launched a 4-year economic plan known as the Monnet Plan, directed by Jean Monnet through the newly created Commissariat Général au Plan, which combined a basically liberal orientation with reformist and state-directed elements to prioritize modernization of key sectors like coal, steel, electricity, and transport in order to overcome pre-war stagnation and achieve what Monnet termed the quote-unquote modernization or decadence as an alternative. This was already, again, today we don't talk about this, baked into the broader European Union formation, right? So this was particularly important in the relations with Germany because unavoidably that precondition of European strength had to firstly start from a Franco-German steel pact, right? That will actually be created together with coal, etc. And in there will again be too much to tell. However, you want to appreciate, and this is again for my largely American and broader Anglosphere, but this is mostly an American thing, in fact, audience, that liberal here does not mean left, all right? Classical liberalism in Europe is a center-right tradition, right? It's a moderate right tradition, fundamentally, and it was still essentially what existed in the West, at the head of the West, even though constantly eroded and threatened, even in France, that had at some point a de facto fascist and a de facto communist governments, democratically elected. This is all before the war, right? During 1920s and 1930s. In fact, the establishment of the world, right? After World War I, for example. Now, France's political reconstruction proved particularly turbulent for different reasons. The country had been heavily torn apart by the war in so many ways that were deeply political, and that will, in fact, agitate the country in the decades to come, with almost revolutions that could break out. France historically has always this massive swings and perturbations. And considering what, in fact, power had to be built here, obviously under the edges of the Western allies. And so in a way that, some people today would even consider like, you're the slaves of the Americans, whatever, but obviously that could not, like in many other phases in civilization, simply take another route, because again, you have people who have political opinions. I mean, between people having political opinions and their political opinions having any value, there is an abyss, as a matter of fact. But also you can't succeed if, in fact, these ideas don't have the decisive moral majority, which is what, at the end of the day, happened in France with all its imperfections. De Gaulle had already resigned from government leadership in January 1946, protesting what he regarded as the excessive power of the political parties, interestingly enough. So there was obviously an authoritarian vibe in store, given what we just said regarding what had to be done for the sake of France. And disagreeing, in fact, with the party's plans for restoring the republican institutions abolished under the Vichy regime. Right. So for the record, again, half of France had not been literally occupied had been literally occupied by the Nazis, but the other was literally also ruled by a French collaborationist regime. So whether you understand it as a puppet state or not, again, the Vichy Republic existed on its own as a fascist polity. So you can imagine all the legacy of this, of France shattered by both world wars in different ways, having quite a complex cultural, territorial history. Think about here, for example, the eastern territories returned to France. You have the Pied Noir, mostly of Alsatian origin, as being very importantly left behind after the Algerian War and the quasi-coup that occurred in France later on. It's a very torn history. Throughout 1946, France underwent a difficult and contentious constituent process as well. This was more problematic, say, than Italy, that we will see later a bit. A first assembly elected in October 1945 and dominated by the mass parties drafted a constitution that submitted to a popular referendum in May 1946 and rejected by a narrow margin. A second assembly elected in June produced a very similar proposal, which reaffirmed the parliamentary character of the republic. This version was approved in a subsequent referendum despite a high rate of abstentions and low voter turnout. In April 1947, while staying largely outside active day-to-day politics, de Gaulle supported the creation of a new movement inspired by himself, obviously enough, the Rally of the French People, the RPF. This organization campaigned for a stronger executive branch and for a majority-based electoral system. In May of the same year, the alliance among the three mass parties broke apart due to disagreements between the communists and their coalition partners, meaningfully enough. Although the disputes began over trade union and labor issues, they were in reality driven by the deeper divisions of the Cold War itself. Right? France is the Western country where communism will create the greatest problems. Even though they didn't even have properly the largest communist party in the West, but they somehow suffered the most of this sort of political mosaicization, fragmentation, given also the tendentially more unitary power and concentration of force with presidentialism, etc., that France has, including with its powers, non-irrelevantly the force de frappe in their hands. Now, with the communists excluded from government thereafter, a succession of unstable cabinets followed. These governments relied on complex agreements between the socialists and centrist parties and were all marked by considerable instability. This chronic governmental instability became a defining feature of the Fourth Republic, just as it had plagued the Third Republic earlier. Over its 12-year span, the Fourth Republic witnessed, in fact, more than 20 different administrations, with frequent ministerial crises hindering decisive action on colonial issues and economic policy alike. Right? The Germans, for example, took a completely different direction as they learned the lessons of the Weimar Republic very, very harshly, and they actually had a much more greater power concentration. You would think, again, peoples who had such strong strongly centralized totalitarian rule would actually, like the Germans themselves and their Nazi past, would move towards something more democratic. This is what the Italians do, for example. But as you understand, there is not a single sort of identical model. Like, they all try something different. They all end up creating something different. Colonial tensions for the French, particularly in Indochina, where war erupted in 1946, further drained resources and complicated domestic stabilization efforts. The parliamentary system concentrated power in the National Assembly, fostering short-lived coalitions that struggle with coherent long-term planning amid frequent vetoes of no confidence. Paradoxically, amid all these developments, defeated Germany, placed under the direct tutelage of the victorious powers, demonstrated the most rapid recovery and the strongest signs of economic vitality and political stability. Right? This is something you really got to appreciate about West Germany. In a deep European sense, the Germans paradoxically are the ones who understand the deepest the value of European unity during this period. Also because they have half of the country occupied by the communists, as a matter of fact. Right? These are the people who, for example, like the Americans did not want Italy into NATO. The Germans said, if Italy does not enter NATO, we also don't enter NATO. So obviously that's also how Italy obviously had to get into NATO anyway, in any meaningful, intelligent way. But you owe it to a people that literally up to a few years ago was with swastikas everywhere, all right, and exterminating millions of Jews. That this is an deeply important change. As I was saying before, many people have not really changed at all. But the leadership that West Germany got was really good, all right? And with all the difficulties that existed in West Germany, and not only because of the obvious destruction of the country. Now, at the end of the war, Germany faced, obviously, this catastrophic situation on every front. Many major cities had been reduced to ruins by Allied bombing. Transportation networks were unusable. The civilian population was reduced to hunger, and the economy had collapsed entirely. In addition, the drastic territorial losses in the east, including East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, and the Sudetenland, triggered an influx of more than 10 million refugees into the Western occupation zones. This was also one of the most historically painful moments in European history. The Prussian nation was fundamentally eradicated from reality. This is, again, very often an underrated aspect of this. There was a very specific will to do so, not just among the Soviets, for that matter, but properly also by the West. Germany had been seen as the sort of redundantly repetitive source of this major global clashes, and as such, its elimination seemed the best solution. And as you know, Prussia is not sort of Germany entirely. It had de facto morphed into it in a politically hegemonic sense with its militarism, with its nationalism. But the core lands of this country on its own, as you know, have a much older history that we also document on Schwerpunkt in many ways. We have to make more about modern Prussian history for that matter. Von Clausewitz is here for a reason, telling the truth. And so you have incredible odds against Germany at this point. The aforementioned refugees had been forced to abandon their former homelands in terrifying conditions, considering also what, the terrifying conditions that those places had turned into, including because of, say, not just these lands that had been, in fact, also at different times occupied, controlled by the Germans, but as you know, those were tormented areas in Germany and Central Eastern Europe for different reasons, including also Nazi conquests and the Soviet comeback. Now, in the Western zones, black market activity thrived amid worthless currency and rationing, while millions of displaced persons strained already scarce resources. It was only in 1949 that Germany regained a form of national sovereignty, albeit a limited one, obviously enough. And just imagine, again, with lots of people who come from places in Germany, what does a Swabian have to do with an East Prussian, right? They have something to do with one another, indeed. But in this moment in history, like, in considering how recent, do you realize that, 100 years prior was 1849? Right, what that meant. We've made videos about Franz Joseph, as a matter of fact, rising to the rule of the Habsburgic Empire at that point. And the speed with which these changes had occurred are scary, are something that we still somehow that this thing happened, it's World War II, right? But do you realize what the world was before World War II? That's what I was trying to tell at the beginning. When we point at specifically contentious political issues and we think we can simply approach them from today's standpoint, right? Now, at the same moment, Germany lost its unity, right? This partial sovereignty was restored through its partition. De facto had already been occupied by all the different main allies. And it was permanently divided in two separate states, separated by the so-called Iron Curtain, each governed by sharply contrasting political systems. That became a bit the symbol of the Cold War, especially in Europe. In May 1949, a parliamentary council made up of delegates from the regional bodies working under the strict supervision of the occupying powers approved the new basic law of the Federal Republic of Germany. I'm going to skip sort of all the more technical things, also for the French parties, all the original names, but for telling you what this sort of meant in a simpler sense. Presented as a provisional constitution, pending eventual national reunification, it retained the federal structure and parliamentary framework of the Weimar Republic, but introduced significant changes, right? It imposed strong limits on the powers of the federal president and included the electoral mechanisms designed to discourage excessive political fragmentation. So as we were anticipating before, they spot in Weimar's Republic's democratic profile, at least of that extent historically, the root cause of the rise of National Socialism, namely the fact that was actually too much of a democratic system. This is quite fascinating. For example, again, we will see it now, the Italians tried a similar pattern to concentrate political power, even more than what the early stages of Mussolini parliamentary reforms had done, and at least initially it failed, so that you have still a pretty varied constitutional arc, right, in Italian governments for this reason. But it's fascinating, again, that the Germans had pretty clearly in mind, in the West, obviously, what to do, right? And several months later, in fact, in the eastern part, the Democratic Republic adopted its own constitution modeled on the quote-unquote people's democracies of the Soviet bloc. Right? Needless to say, this was a complete farce. It featured a single ruling party, the Socialist Unity Party, the CED, created through the forced merger of communists and left-wing social democrats. Despite these extremely difficult initial conditions, the German economy once again displayed remarkable resilience and an exceptional capacity for recovery. In the Eastern Zone, progress was hindered by the heavy burden of reparations demanded by the Soviet Union and by the forced collectivization of industry and agriculture. So that, as you know, also after the reunification of Germany, East Germany is a disaster. Actually, one of the other great accomplishments of Germany as a country was the successful absorption of most of these sort of Eastern issues and the partial fixing of them. But obviously, wherever communism goes, it brings nothing but misery, shame, and inferiority. By contrast, West Germany benefited enormously from its close integration into the Western Bloc. Right? The West is inherently superior in the God-given mandate to rule over the world. The United States viewed the Federal Republic, in fact, not only as a key forward bastion of the Atlantic Alliance, for obvious reasons, but also as a showcase of quote-unquote, at least capitalist prosperity. Remember always that the term is a communist one, forged just like to better target what they want to steal from your property. And in this context, given that indeed modernity and secularism were looking mostly at the socioeconomical issues, deliberately contrasted with the more austere, quote-unquote, Spartan model of the Eastern countries, for not saying with its traumatically shocking misery. Right, and so it's incredibly important that the United States, as we were saying before, are able to make this leap forward, and that obviously, just to correct bad jokes about China later on, but say that actually recognize Germany as truly not just like an inferior people that the Americans had destroyed, but actually the truly redeemed and in this sense transcended nation that would be probably put against in the front as a model of the West against communism, right? Accordingly, the Americans renounced the war reparations owed to them from the Germans. Remember that there was a plan at a point that the Americans were even about to sign to completely bring Germany back to the Stone Age, to completely deindustrialize them, to let practically people starve to death in the millions. This was actually to be done. We will go back to it. This thing is eventually not done. Obviously, it was already understood at the time to be very contentious. But again, don't think that the Americans were those charitable people that simply helped the West, and especially, obviously, the Axis powers that came de facto into their hands, because they were so good-hearted. All right, again, the Americans were deeply, again, racism was normal in a racialistic, ideological sense at the time, including against people like the Germans. All right, and were considered inferior as they had been beaten in many ways. This is true also for, the British openly claimed during World War II that Italians were racially inferior. I mean, this was completely normal. All right, in a broader sense, we explained before. And this is actually what is the more striking about this whole. That the Americans condoned the Germans, the West Germans, this the crimes, the sins of World War II, obviously provided the Nuremberg trial and the sort of the fact that the Germans eventually not just put to death different people, but also incarcerated 30,000 of them, and it was never fully complete. Like there was never, Germany was the best example of this, as we said before. Italy and Japan got away with that for different reasons. Again, also Japan, there was a strategic reason for it to be not to be fundamentally so crushed. The Germans were the ones who more morally expiated for the crimes of National Socialism, but also the ones that in fact got the most practical political benefit from their doing largely, as well as also American support, right? The US, in fact, allowed the Federal Republic to benefit from the same Marshall Plan assistance. And ultimately, many debts will be condoned to Germany, also pretty recent history for that matter. The 1948 currency reform, replacing the inflated Reichsmark with the Deutsche Mark at a steep conversion rate while simultaneously abolishing most Nazi-era price controls under Economics Minister Ludwig Erhard, unleashed pent-up productive forces and added black market dominance almost overnight. Interestingly enough, stimulated by the government's energetic policy of promoting investment, particularly under Erhard, who later reduced marginal tax rates in 1948 and 1949, the West German productive apparatus quickly returned to full operation, with national output recovering to 1938 levels by 1951 and average annual growth rates around 8% in the early 1950s. Right. So again, it's true also that West Germany, in spite of all destruction, etc., was a better put country than the East. And in general, again, it had led marvelous military force. I mean, so there were the fundamentals to rebuild something that the Germans themselves knew how to handle pretty well, as they had survived the war under enormous pressure. But in this very sense, you cannot districate this from the moral dimension of this achievement, right? The Germans wanted this. The Germans succeeded in this, right? Other people may have not, right? All this laid the groundwork for the prolonged Wirtschaftswunder, so the economic miracle. The European coal and steel community established in 1952 among France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg further integrated key industries and symbolized a shift from rivalry to shared economic management. These are very important steps. Again, here I just mentioned it, but I will make an entire video about that because this is so important as a continental moment. All right. Erhard's broader liberalization complemented the currency overhaul by incentivizing work, savings, and entrepreneurship, proving more decisive for sustained growth than external aid alone. Again, I can't stress this enough for how gigantic the Marshall Plan was and for how much actually went to West Germany for the obvious reason of developing the massive potential and strategic assets that the German industry and defense had. This was mainly pulled off by the West German people as such. All right, this is a massive moral victory from a country that had been literally obliterated to ashes. And it shows you what it means to be European. Throughout Western Europe, the Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, provided critical grants and loans totaling over $13 billion, roughly $137 billion in today's value, helping to close the dollar gap, restore trade, and stabilize governments against communist influence, while encouraging early steps toward economic cooperation that would later evolve into broader integration efforts. Recipient nations committed to counterpart funds, local currency equivalents often directed toward investment, further amplifying the plan's multiplier effects, and the program led to the creation of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation to coordinate aid distribution, planting seeds for supranational institutions that would evolve into the European Economic Community in 1957. In countries like Italy and the Benelux nations, similar patterns of nationalization in key sectors, social security expansion, and coalition politics emerged, tempered by Cold War divisions that sidelined more radical leftist agendas and prioritized recovery through market-oriented reforms backed by American aid. Today, we mostly focused on Britain, France, Germany. I will probably make an entire video about Italy, right? But a brief mention must be made for this other country that, again, in and of itself was a miracle. Under Christian Democrat leader Alcide de Gasperi, who served as prime minister from 1945 to 1953, centrist coalitions implemented land reforms in the south through the 1950 Legge Stralcio, targeting large estates in regions like the Silla Plateau in Sicily to redistribute land to peasants and reduce rural poverty and communist influence at the same time. It's a bit like what, I don't know, a random example, Bismarck had done by allying with the Catholics and promoting social welfare in Wilhelmine, Germany, to prevent this to be developed from the socialists that were pushing for it. So the masses shifted in great part towards that more Christian influence as opposed to the socialist one. Here in Italy, you have the expansion of social housing and unemployment insurance. Also, the draft of a progressive 1948 constitution emphasizing labor rights and anti-fascist principles, while martial aid helped revive northern industry and agriculture despite ongoing communist strength in some regions. Right? Italy is a very difficult country to explain for those especially who would not come from especially the continental side of the story at that point from the same Italy. These years were pretty tough. Like the Italian Miracolo Economico happened later in the last couple of decades of the 1950s and up to 1963 basically. And there were some particular conjunctures that favored Italian finances internationally and so on. But as you know, the country became like a powerhouse of economic growth, and it became literally, I think, like the fourth largest economy at some point, even surpassing the Brits. What is worth noticing, however, is that is a bunch of things. First of all, we're saying it before, Italy was never fully purged from fascism other than the actions, the purges of the resistance itself. There were some actions directed at fascist crimes, etc., but at large, the country was not demanded a particular moral exaction from its past. In part, the reason was that Italian-American voters in the United States would have been displeased by a too harsh treatment of Italy that the Americans in general, however, did not think much of to begin with. So that's also a bit the moment in which the idea of the useful idiot that is bad at war and good at, I don't know, food came around to represent a more sort of sympathetic, relaunched idea of Italy right on the scene. The other interesting aspect is that the Americans themselves did not have much of an understanding of Italy institutionally, of its culture. For example, fascism in Italy had been teaching idealism a great deal. And when Americans were to basically purge Italian school programs once they occupied the country, they didn't care or understand very much, and in Italian school curricula, still to this day, I presume, there is, for example, a disproportionate emphasis on Hegel that not even in Germany is studied so strongly today. This brought, at the same time, to relatively scarce change. Was, as we explained before, new constitution, mostly drafted in a compromise between the Catholics and the communists. As you know, the Republic had won over the monarchy, and so there was a big change. The Savoy House went in exile. But in this sense, what happened in Italy is that the amount of nationalizations and so statally run business that we're pointing out before largely was inherited straight from fascism, from the fascist state, that, as we explained, was sort of deeply again, nationalized at least. Somebody could say socialistic in the sense that, you could call even Nazi Germany socialistic to some degree. I'm not going to open that topic once again, because it may mean different things depending on what you mean holistically, especially by socialists. So Italians largely inherited this level of nationalization that, to a degree, even helped them go through the rough path that these early years especially represented. There was a lot of repression of communism in those early days. Actually, the Interior Ministry did really a good job maintaining control. This is deeply recognized. There were some, again, literally Soviet revolutions attempted at some point. Some mountains at some point were taken by some former communist partisans. The army went there to suppress. It was very interesting, and her story. There were some clandestine organizations eventually created in NATO, because Italy was not so central like Germany and France as far as the advance of a communist of the Red Army across Europe. But in this sense, it also had a majorly strategic relevance in the Mediterranean. We've seen it in the video about the raid on Taranto that happened early on in the war, that turned out at this point, however, for NATO to be probably what dominated the entire Mediterranean. It's a hell of a naval base. So the Americans gradually discovered Italy in its political and strategic potential, even though always sort of felt like it was a bit less loyal overall. And yet, you want to appreciate that among all Southern European countries, Italy is the only one that developed as an actual democracy. All other Southern European countries had sort of different anti-democratic parentheses, communists, fascists, etc. Italy pulled off this major feat in and of itself, and represented, in fact, a pillar of NATO, and something that probably would have not been expected in some broader sense. All right, so chapeau to the Italians for that as well. The Benelux countries are also at the beating heart of Europe at many different levels. They represented a bit like some broader cultural symbol of an agglutination of countries that had emerged out of even some relatively recent history, and that had their own financiary tradition. They had suffered importantly during the wars, plural. So they represented an idea of classical liberalism expressed truly, again, in the moderate, not leftist view of continental political language. The Benelux countries pursue parallel paths equally. Belgium's 1944 Social Pact laid groundwork for comprehensive social security covering illness, unemployment, and pensions, in enabling rapid recovery with minimal war damage, while the Netherlands introduced a state old age pension in 1947, later formalized, and focused on centralized planning for housing, regional development, and modernization, receiving substantial Marshall support to rebuild its devastated infrastructure in ports such as Rotterdam. Right, you know what happened, say at least in some parts of the country during the war, and the Nazis had held those territories for a consistent amount of time because the Allies had not managed to break through. They would do further south. So again, I also made a video about the Battle of the Ardennes if you're interested, and we will look at some point at things like Market Garden and so on. Now, this era of Reconstruction thus blended ambitious social experimentation with pragmatic economic stabilization, setting the stage for decades of relative prosperity amid ongoing ideological tensions. And we are the product of this, right? Europe, including the one that was from the other side today, owes to the accomplishments of these countries enormously. So much so that most of the money actually still comes from there. It's difficult not to see what we normally observe also on Schwerpunkt, looking at other times in history and how relevant, of course, Western Europe is for not just for some random war outcome, but exactly as the very specific historical necessity almost this has to fulfill. All right. This video is, again, I presume, I don't know how many people are going to watch it. Sometimes make these videos and people are like, we're not interested, we don't care. But honestly, I love this part of history because when I was younger, until I went to university, I had no real understanding of how deeply foundational and important this really all was. I developed an enormous set of sort of political awareness by studying this specific part of European politics, and I've always remained opinionated ever since. Like, I actually was already interested in this, not just because, as a Western European myself, I have a lot to reflect on this and sort of a lot of anecdotal background to compare, also in a historiographical sense. But because I presume that you can't really understand world's history if you cross out this from your culture. I mean, this may be just a banal complaint, because I could make the overarching knowledge and explanation of how and why this thing matters in a deep, grand historical sense. This is true. But the thing that actually disconcerted me in my life, like just looking at what foreigners think and how, especially again, the world outside, even among Europeans, how unaware people are of these countries' political history is something that always amazes me. I mean, how can you understand? I mean, here we're talking some of the countries that made the world. They're still the largest economies out there. They still have much of the power that they established at that point, and on the basis, naturally, of their previous history. But how can't you really study this stuff hard? Admittedly, we don't study very much in continental Europe, American political history. So you could say the identical same from the other side. But even among Europeans, not being in newer generations knowledgeable in this topic, having a vague idea of countries like flags and stereotypes without getting the actual power willed and where does it come from and why and who are these people and why are we the way we are. This is painfully dangerous and damaging at the same time. It's great part of the reason why even a proper sense of European unity is constantly misunderstood as some sort of centralizing and oppressive process, or how it also turned out to be in a certain sense, but mostly in the populistic propaganda, whether from the left or the right. Remember that Europe self-professed itself, put at the same plan fascism and communism, for that matter, for rejecting the both of them as the foundation of the union, for that matter. And when you look at the latter, in fact, you have to appreciate what came before. Like, it's not the European Union was born out of nowhere by specific interest. It stemmed from the necessity of handling and rationalizing and homogenizing a large amount of power, of wealth, of people, of territory in the world like our own, that still is so central and de facto still unassailable, as explained also in a recent video by anyone, in spite of all the perceived weaknesses that in part also exist of the system. So studying this history, especially if you have no specific clue, and already, like, for you, history is just medieval battles, ancient warfare, whatever, like, I understand that you're probably not going to be even inclined to learn much to begin with. And I say it as a PhD specializing in medieval tactical reconstruction. But this is exactly the point. If you watch my content and you're aware of what I do here, you may want to really appreciate or wonder at least how and why I cover these topics and why they're so important and why we're surely going to come back on them as well, right? So I'm really proud to announce, as I said at the beginning, that we started our manualistic history of contemporary and modern era. I already know what's in store, that the next thing is still be contemporary, still being, 19th, 20th century. I know it because, as you know, I prepared this in advance. So we're going to add this to the largely military topic here. I see that dominated our 20th century playlist, and that made a fair amount of views after all. And so I'm actually very prone to continue this because I can't deny it. I've always been fascinated as a medievalist about modern contemporary era for two reasons. One is probably the one that, as I explained before, would probably gather attention from anyone, because if you talk about these topics, you have sort of a connection with my perspective and everything, with the present, with the pretty recent events, after all. But the other that always impressed me is how can you provide with an exhaustive narrative of such a time like the 20th century. I mean, for someone like me that really gets down to primary sources to, at some point, describe an entire event in the early 14th century, military-wise, the question is, considering the sources at our disposal regarding the 20th century, how are we even going to explain it? Obviously, on Schwerpunkt, I have my sort of record beating in terms of, I don't know how many videos made for hours each, debating all these topics. But the question is, can we do it? Can we have a channel that can provide with some reliably satisfactory take on all eras, but in particular this that is still relatively subject to more volatile interpretation, so to say. Accuracy, objectivity, they're not easy to get. But I think, and this may sound banal, but I think it's true, that obviously the more you teach and the more you know, right? The more you learn to explain to somebody else and having to make sense of it, and really saying something that has a depth of value that can be profitably and positively expandable, well, you must have a specific ability to frame it in the way reality more or less presented it as to you, like in its reconstruction, yes, but also through big events that you sort of get. And this presents you with so many methodological and philosophical issues, meaning it's paradoxical. We all know that World War II existed, happened, and we'll have a kind of an idea of what happened, which is largely correct in the fundamentals, but how different the vision on the same can be. And also I think that political expandability of these topics is crucial, because as I just said, you can't look at them in a detached way. What I said before regarding the political history of Western countries, well, it's kind of obvious why you should know that, because you can easily profit from it today. You can see why things are the way they are, how easy it is to steer people in the right direction, given that the roots of these events are so recent and can be reasonably seen as reasonably familiar. When you talk about the 17th century, what the hell do you know about the general feeling of people? You can't even make a history of that kind, but it's more like collecting a picture regarding what more or less it would have been built, but you don't have the straightforward closeness and especially the idea of complexity that you normally get for these topics as well, simply because you have so many different references to the diversity of reality that you don't have for the 17th century, even if you were so knowledgeable for it. So it's all very interesting, and I think that history always needs a narrative. You can't fool people by claiming that history, all it is really, getting in line of a mechanistic repetition. At the end of the day, how do you interpret the sources, and even that chain? How is it put together? Like, what does it actually mean, right? The flattening and depressingly shallow, in the sense, modes of history that are presented online very often. That is, I cite something, so this is history. It's pretty dumb in and of itself, right? So every time I talk about, here what I said, the Battle of the Ardennes, do I need a specific citation for explaining what that was in the rough? And if I'm wrong about the facts, right? But in general, like, if you find a knowledgeable enough person who's eventually kind of getting the point, what I notice is that it's more like ignorant people who truly think that you don't know history because they literally don't know what you're talking about, even in the fundamentals. And this is the paradox that also makes me think that incentivizing this notion of always wanting to go back to the actual printed words, like in the citation in the book, is some sort of nominalistic heresy. It is not history. It's a sort of toll that people want you to pay over what? Like, anything of what I said here, like I said, there is interpretation, but is the amount of information we provided wrong? How many channels do what I do here? That's the question you should ask yourself, not because I received, again, any particular pushback or criticism or whatever, but it's obvious that the larger the channel and the more people are going to pose themselves questions. We had sort of an increase in subscriptions, as was already repeating yesterday. And sometimes you don't even know why that's the case. What is that people are attracted to this content that is otherwise pretty strange, and as such, again, it's an endeavor that we should be take under together, and mostly being very careful in doing so, like observing step by step why make this content, what is the meaning of this all, and why are we here to begin with. So the videos may be more or less flashy, they may attract more or less attention, but in general, right, there is a video like this, I think, is precious on YouTube. I think that nobody even makes videos like these anymore. Truly, I mean, it's even probably the framework of YouTube that makes not just people who have the more visible content, but anyone pretty much thinking that what you should make on YouTube is first the YouTube format, and secondly what you actually have to say. And so Schwerpunkt sort of defies this, right? And here I see, if I say, for example, here on YouTube, the Reconstruction era, it's mostly, again, an American dominated platform of some sort in the media, the Reconstruction era after the US Civil War. But I hear also at Reconstruction era, World War II, again, I get Civil War stuff, all 19th century. Where is European Reconstruction after World War II? Where is also probably American Reconstruction, so to say, in a more philologically, etymologic meaning of the term, after World War II? Right? There isn't much here. I don't see it. And so I have to conclude, as it's become dreadfully dramatic, that I'm possibly the only person, not, I'm sure, talking, that there's plenty of videos that talk about these individual stuff, but that's even conceptualize this as an era on its own worth discussing. And this also reconfirms to me, by the way, that there is an incredible self-referentiality of the topics themselves. It's not even the people or their countries or their culture that produces them. It's literally, this topic has become a genre just because other people have done it, but the rest does not exist. There is not an autonomous historical interest kind of anymore. And so I'm really content, especially with today's video, that, again, to me is just not even a very short introduction. It's something minimal, considering the enormity of the topic, the individual topics treated. However, it will do as a starter. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.